You can do brand stuff too, from pure brand demand generation type on LinkedIn, but SEO is really the compounding return that you're going to get over time, versus a company that's very sales heavy, right? Something like an enterprise level, like the plan or pro plan of HubSpot, or Gong is a good example too, right? Those websites don't benefit as much from SEO because the sales cycles are longer and the buyers aren't really searching for those things, specifically, right? And so until they're looking for, say, comparison type stuff. So if you want to capture demand, if you're that type of company, I would focus more on brand awareness, on LinkedIn type content, trying to get a bunch of reach, or some advertising that's
Wanna cause no problems. I just wanna live my life, but I keep on hearing about nonsense. Me and my dons ain't mobsters, but when you see imposters, we know how to read them faces, same way you know how to read them comments. If you wanna talk, let's talk, but around here, make sure you walk and your talk is constant.
Well, everybody, welcome to the Death to Vanilla podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Burkhart, and I am very excited to bring on someone that, I've thoroughly enjoyed his content, and he has, in the content marketing and the SEO space, just really driving growth for businesses. And his name's Skyler Reeves, and so he is on the podcast today. And so we're going to talk about all kind of different things about topic clustering and gathering data, which is obviously a big hot topic right now with cookies disappearing and so on and so forth. And so, so I would love, Skyler, if you could just introduce yourself, talk to us a little bit about your business and what you're doing, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, glad to be here, Stephen. Name's Skyler Reeves. I'm the founder and CEO of Ardent Growth. We're a content intelligence consultancy. We primarily focus on working with B2B SaaS companies, especially those with like a product-led motion, on developing content strategies so that they know exactly what content they need to create and what order to get the best results in the shortest amount of time possible.
Awesome. Isn't that what every business wants, right? Massive results very quickly, which honestly is challenging with content. But before we jump into that, before we started the podcast, you had made mention that like all content strategies aren't a one size fit all, right? So there's content strategies for brands and for SEO and for some other things. So walk us through a little bit about maybe not the intricacies of how it's different, but like that was definitely my first time kind of hearing it explained that way, because I view things very much from like a brand building perspective when it comes to content, but also knowing full well that like SEO driven content is super helpful because of course you're putting that on your website and that needs to drive traffic and stuff like that. So give us a little bit of framework for how that looks different in each different context, because that was certainly a surprise to me, and I'm sure it is to other people listening.
Yeah. So the way you can think about it is your thought leadership type content, or anything that's company culture, right? If its primary purpose is for, say, internal marketing purposes, right, to be able to recruit and retain talent, that type of content is very different from, say, your SEO driven content, right? Like that type of thought leadership, or anything that's related to some sort of data that you've pulled, right? That people like, things that people aren't searching for. That type of content's meant for demand generation, right? For creating demand. The SEO type content for whenever people have a job to be done, right? They've got a problem to be solved. They're not aware you exist, or perhaps they are aware you exist. That's more for capturing that demand, right? Whenever they're already in market with an intent to buy, or additionally for retention as well. It's helpful there, especially once someone's already, say, a customer and they're trying to, whether you're a service-based business and they want to figure out how to contact you, or whether you're a SaaS company and they're trying to, work out your API documentation, right? You want to be able to rank for those things. And there's a little bit of a middle ground there too, when you're going into comparison stuff, that you can do a bit of brand with that, but also it can be for search when people are looking for, versus comparing a Asana to Trello or something like that. So they're very, very different. You should approach them different ways. And then you've got content that's not on the website at all, right? Content that you're producing to meet people where they're at, whether that's on LinkedIn, whether that's, in different feeds or YouTube, et cetera. It doesn't always have to, exist as written content on your blog either. So a way to think about it, though, in terms of a framework, is that depending on what type of business model that you have and what your constraints are, is how you want to think about how content can relieve those constraints. So if you're a product-led motion business and with some sort of freemium or free trial going on, SEO can be very, very beneficial because you tend to have a lower ACV, right? And so you need volume. You need people to come in, set up a trial, right, and then try to convert them to a paid user from there. And doing that from a paid perspective can get pretty expensive. It's hard to scale over a long period of time. And so SEO type content to drive people in is super helpful there. You can do brand stuff too, from pure brand demand generation type on LinkedIn, but SEO is really the compounding return that you're going to get over time, versus a company that's very sales heavy, right? Something like an enterprise level, like the plan or pro plan of HubSpot, or Gong is a good example too, right? Those websites don't benefit as much from SEO because the sales cycles are longer and the buyers aren't really searching for those things, specifically, right? And so until they're looking for, say, comparison type stuff. So if you want to capture demand, if you're that type of company, I would focus more on brand awareness on, LinkedIn type content, trying to get a bunch of reach, or some advertising that's, showcasing, who you work with, why people work with you, what you can do. So that's the way I would look at it. It just depends on your constraints. If you're a product-led company as well, and you have, you've got plenty of free users, you're not trying to get more free users, right? Let's say you're Grammarly, right? Like Grammarly doesn't need more free users, right? They need to convert more paid users, because every free user takes up server space, right? That has costs associated with it. So their content would then shift to being more, weighing on the pros and the benefits of, why, for example, when you go to the paid plan, you can manage brand assets, right? And so now your content can shift towards that versus just fixing grammar, and you're pitching brand consistency to the, heads of content, CMOs, whatever, things like that, to try to get them over to a paid plan. So you just got to think about what your constraints are and how you make money, really, and map a content strategy to that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. With Grammarly, it's definitely a different place in the funnel for sure. And then, of course, at that point, why would you need highly searchable web content? That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And when they first started, completely different game though, right? And they still benefit from having it, because people are still going to be coming in market all the time, right? But they've got a large enough brand now, they're not brand new, right? That their biggest constraint is probably, try to get people over to a paid plan at the organization enterprise level.
Well, cool. No, that sounds awesome. So one of the ways that you talk about really having, I would assume, the more SEO driven content work for you is topic clustering. I'm assuming that's more on the SEO side. As we talked about before we started the podcast, there's definitely something a little bit more like ambiguous. It's not quite as maybe as much as like household name type understanding of it. And so I'd love for you to kind of demystify that a little bit for us. I certainly heard about it from HubSpot when I went and did some of their training. So I understand conceptually what the topic clustering is, but I would love for you to give us your perspective on what that looks like and demystify it a little bit. Sure.
So for anyone who isn't aware, topic clustering, it's something that HubSpot started promoting. It's actually a lot older than that. It comes from computer science and graph theory and stuff. But topic clustering is the idea from a content perspective that you're going to kind of create this one central sort of page that's targeting like a broad topic, right? And you're going to build these spoke pages off of it. So it's like a hub and spoke model that are targeting these longer tail question, deeper problem concerns, and then you interlink it all together on your website. What this does is this helps tell Google, hey, all this content goes together. I know what I'm talking about. It helps build what we call topical authority, trust with Google, and helps you just rank better over time. It's also great for users because when they come into a subject, they can kind of move around in a sphere of content that's maybe answering questions that they weren't thinking of prior, right? That maybe they weren't searching for, and so it keeps them on your site longer, builds more trust, etc. Now, my problem with topic clustering was that so I come into this world from computer science. I was a computer scientist before I started this business, and my particular focus was on algorithms and like routing problems and solving things like that. And when I was reading HubSpot talking about topic clustering, they would talk about, like I said, pick this, broad topic and then build these topics out around it. And I was like, okay, that's great and all, but how do you know what content, right? If you're going to look at this from a keyword perspective, how do you know what content needs to be on what page? How many pages you're going to need to flesh out this topic? How do you prevent 2 pages from competing with one another? Or how do you know that in some instances, maybe you need to break one piece of content into 2, right? To be able to match the searcher's intent, what the searcher's actually looking for when they're searching for it. Because if you don't match that, you have a very difficult time ranking. And no one really had an answer to this. It was, like I said, it was all kind of based on gut. And I wasn't a big fan of that. I wanted to try to reduce, uncertainty, right? And that's one of the drivers of human beings. We want to reduce uncertainty and risk. And so we worked on an algorithm, developed an algorithm that can ingest just tons of data and then build these topic clusters from it using what Google is telling us about how they want to group it together. So we crawl a bunch of the data from the search results pages for all of these things, look for the overlap between them and use that to map out these clusters. And so it's a very data-driven approach. It's much faster actually than doing it gut-based, and you get a more holistic and broader picture of your total addressable market. And what's really useful with it now is that, one, you know exactly what content you need to create. And one of the secondary problems that we faced that was we weren't expecting in the beginning was, you solve the first problem and then you're like, great, now what? Right. So it's like, okay, now we understand how these things need to be clustered together. We know what site architecture needs to look like. We know, how many articles we need to create. So that tells us an idea of budget from a resource perspective. But then the question came, where do we start? What order? How do we prioritize these things, right? And so then we worked on that, and we worked out a way to prioritize and tell you, here's what you need to do next. And that's been super, super helpful for especially blogs and websites already have a decent amount of content, because we're able to say, okay, look, based on what the data is telling us here, you need to create these 3 pages. And if you do, you're going to rank very, very quickly for them. We're looking at things like, what's the value of the page, right? Like, does it have conversion intent? Does it fill kind of a slot in a different part of the funnel, right? We try to be focused on like, how does this drive to business outcomes, ultimately? Yeah. And it's been phenomenal so far. I mean, we published a page, I think this one highly competitive term, like one of those best X for Ys for this one client we were working for, and published it on like the 20th, and by the 24th, it was ranking on the first page. And that's like a 90,000, search volume per month term. And so that's pretty impactful for that business. Yeah. So.
Okay. So when you're talking about like overlap and stuff like that, are we talking about typically pages like not being quite specific enough? And so then in that case, it makes it difficult for both the searcher and Google to really understand what it's about, or what typically was the catch?
Yeah. So what we looked at initially, we tried to think about approaching this using natural language processing. And then I thought about it more and I said, there's no reason for us to do NLP on this. Google has already done that, right? So we need to just look to see what Google has done and take it from there. And so what we look at is whenever you run let's say 500,000 keywords through this thing, if you're doing it for a company with a large TAM, we're looking at the overlap in terms of which URLs are ranking for all of these keywords. And what you'll find, let's say you take 2 topics and you search for them on Google and you look at them side by side, what you want to look for is do the websites that rank for topic A, are they the same websites that rank for topic B? It's not going to be 10 out of 10 most of the times, but you want to look for a high overlap. So we'll look at, say, do at least 3 or 4 pages rank in the top 10. And we actually tend to look at what's the percentage of those pages that are ranking that have an overlap similarity in the top 5 as well, because as you move down the search results, you'll often see they start to change a little bit in terms of the angle, right? And so that's letting you know that the search intent is actually changing. And so a page down there that's ranking 10 may rank number 1 for a separate topic, right? So So we look at the overlap between the pages and let Google tell us how it wants to group things together rather than trying to, reverse engineer and build our own NLP algorithm ourselves.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot more work.
Yeah.
To just clarify on like what articles or topics or content that it's making, you're able to kind of decipher what's going to have like the kind of more of like the quick win, so that they can start churning through the traffic while you're building some of the other pieces out.
Yeah, so it depends on where the business is at, right? So if they're brand new starting out, really at that point, it's like, okay, let's cluster things together just so we know what needs to be discussed on each page. But you really just need to start producing content so we can get a baseline of where things are going to go. But if you're a more established company, like it's like QuickBooks, ActiveCampaign, something like that, like that already have a ton of content, it allows you to prioritize things. But you also want to look at the constraints, right, that the business is facing right now. Like what's their initiative for the quarter? What's their initiative for the year, right? Have they launched a new product that they're trying to break into? If so, maybe you focus around that more because you're trying to build that out versus, fleshing out a more kind of well-established topic. What's really handy here though, too, is that the way we have this developed is that we can find, especially when you're going into a new, so let's say you've launched a new product, let's say your ClickUp, and now you offer Whiteboard as part of your, massive suite of applications, right? So
right.
We can find what we call bridge topics, where we can begin to think, okay, what other topics through this web and this graph get connected to the concept of whiteboards, right? And so we'll look to see where you're already ranking well, and we'll create that bridge topic that talks about these two concepts together, and that allows you to kind of break into this brand new product that maybe you have, or this topic you haven't addressed before, and work your way from the bottom up, which is also helpful because then you get to kind of start with more bottom of funnel content, things like that. Another prioritization thing that we look at though is we think about what's the value of this versus just like, we don't like volume is an indicator in some instances of value, but not always, right? Because not everything that gets searched for has value associated with it. Like what's Joe Biden's birth date or something like that, right? Like there's no transactional value there. So when we're calculating this too, we're also looking at, okay, what's the traffic potential, but also what's the value potential from it. And we do that. The way to approach that is think about one of two ways. If you don't have clean data and you don't know exactly like what your conversion rates and like sales cycle kind of plays out there in a very from a blog perspective, then you can look at what are people paying for this traffic, right? And you can say, okay, if that's what people are paying for it, here's a rough heuristic of what the value would be at a low end. But if you actually have good conversion data on your blog, like, okay, this generates this many MQLs, this converts into qualified opportunities, and here's what our close rate is, then you can we'll incorporate that data instead and map it to different sections of the content based on funnel stage to get an idea of what's the actual value of us creating this content. How many leads could this actually produce, right? Or like how much revenue can that turn into, at an upper and lower bound threshold.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And that actually makes me think back to, because I was telling you, I was snooping on your LinkedIn before we got started. And that was actually interesting because I think you actually have a story about one of your own pages on your website that actually happened. So I'd love for you to tell that story.
Are you talking about the one that generated a ton of traffic and no value?
Yeah, the one you guys actually took it down, right?
Yeah. We back when we first started, we were working primarily with small businesses, and we wrote a guide to Google My Business, which is very important to small businesses when it comes to ranking. And it started ranking, picked up very, very quickly. There, we were outranking Google's own stuff for it and HubSpot and everyone else. And it was driving a ton of traffic to our site, but very, either it converted very little, or a lot of the conversions just weren't good quality leads. And so, not thinking about that in the beginning, right? Of like, one, how many small businesses are there out there, right? How many of them don't really have budget, right? It's like, this is attracting the wrong type of traffic, versus instead of maybe going after a different topic, that's maybe something along more, if we're looking at the local space, it would be, how to manage Google My Business for multi-location businesses, right? Now that's much more specific, and if they're a multi-location business, they're probably more sophisticated. They actually have budget, right? Like there is a marketing, in-house marketing coordinator or something like that, or a CMO maybe sometimes if it's a large enough company, versus just general Google My Business Guide. I mean, this is covering everything from, your a mom and pop shop down to someone who's working a photography business from home or something like that, right? So yeah, so it's we ended up taking it, it's still actually up on the site because I didn't want to remove the value that the information provided from people who might want it, right? But we took effectively like all of the any sort of conversion intent, CTAs and stuff like that away from it, kind of siloed it off on its own. That way it could still provide value to people who needed it, but would reduce, the noise on our end from a lead flow perspective. We also filtered a lot of that traffic out of our analytics because we didn't really care about looking at it. So.
Right. Well, I feel like that is kind of like the SEO equivalent of vanity metrics, right? Because we talk about that a lot when it comes to like social media, where it's like, okay, you have a huge follower count or lots of likes or whatever else like that. But at the end of the day, what does that mean in dollars? Like, okay, you have 1 million followers, but like if you're making, $10 a month, then like what value, unless there's some future plan to turn that into revenue, like, so what? And so I feel like that's kind of like the SEO version of that, of like, okay, you wrote an article that brings in, 100,000 unique searches a week. Oh, that's really cool. But at the end of the day, like, did it make you any revenue? So if we can't answer that, then you found your vanity metric.
Yeah, there's some things to look at there too. And that's whether it's on social or whether it's on your website, is that if you're seeing users go up, right? Like you would expect to also, if you overlay this with Salesforce data or wherever you're tracking revenue, is your revenue going up as well? Because it's going to be hard sometimes, especially for the high volume topics, to directly tie it to revenue, depending on what your sales cycle looks like. If if you have a short sales cycle, less than 90 days, you can kind of look at like first click attribution on like a 90-day look back window by landing page to get a sense of it. But if it's greater than 90 days, you're not always going to see that. There's a lot of cross-device stuff that falls out of it, right? But but when you're looking at those things, like look at revenue, and then also look at qualitative feedback, I think, from people who talk to you, right? So like if someone says, if you're getting feedback from people saying, I saw a post on LinkedIn, right? And then maybe it was 2 months later, they were consuming your content for a couple months, and they finally Googled your company's name, looked you up, contacted you. Your attribution data is going to say it was organic or direct or, one way or another, but really it was, from say LinkedIn originally. So look at qualitative feedback, but also look at revenue. Is it trending up? If it's not, then you need to change your strategy. You need to produce different content.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are some like common misconceptions that people have about this topic clustering? Like what are like some common mistakes or misunderstandings that they have?
That's a good question. I think that most people will oftentimes look at things from a vanity metric perspective, or they're basing what their success criteria is off of, say, MQLs versus like really comes down to how they define MQL, like what is an actual qualified lead, right? And so when marketing doesn't have, when they're not looking at revenue data and they're not kind of tying themselves to that, I think one of the problems is they look at topic clustering like, okay, let's produce all this content and, let's try to drive leads, but maybe they're not the right type of leads. Beyond that, probably the most common mistake is looking at it from a gut instinct. We've seen time and time again, every website we've run this on, we look at it and we say, okay, I see what you did here. It was great that you produced content. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Like you had to do something, but hey, we need to take this, we need to break this out into 2 separate pages, or we need to consolidate these other 2 pages, right? Because they're competing with one another. And so that's what happens when you look at it from like a gut perspective. And yeah, that's actually probably the biggest one, is just kind of approaching it based on gut.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you see, like, obviously this is going to, vastly depend on the kind of business. But I know you work primarily with the B2B SaaS. So like, how do you see, like social media fitting in with some of the like the content strategies you guys are doing for these topic clusters? Like, is it just distribution of that content, or is there some other like greater intention or strategy that you typically see working well in tandem with those efforts?
Yeah. So again, depending on, right, like are you trying to create a new category? You know, going up against existing incumbents will kind of dictate how you're going to produce content on your website. But what we like to do is we like to start with, we'll do our keyword research, but we also like to do customer research, right? And we want to find where there's an overlap between the two. That way, when you go to create this content, it's useful content that addresses problems that people have, that people are searching for, right? That drives value from the business from a search perspective to capture it. But it also allows you to take the concepts that you were talking about in those articles, right? Addressing these problems that you got from real direct feedback. Like, actually talk to your customers. Don't just review gong calls. Don't just look at chat logs, right? Talk to them. Drill in to really figure out, like do the whole why thing, the 3 whys, right? Where it's like, you ask them why, and answer, you ask why. Keep drilling down and really understand what the deep underlying motivation behind the issues that they have are. So then when you produce that content in your blog, right, great for search, but then it gives you a really good kind of nexus of content to then post on social. Now we're not saying write the blog, post the links on social. I think that's a waste of time, right? It reduces your reach. The platforms want to keep people on the platforms, right? So
Absolutely.
Why don't you just meet people where they're at and just talk about the things that you were talking about on your website on social, right? It's accomplishing the same goal, right? Which is top of funnel awareness, or capturing demand, making people aware of you, et cetera. But stirs up conversation. You have those conversations right there where people already are. That's how we like to look at the kind of interplay between them. There's other opportunities though too, depending on what type of medium that you're using. So if you're creating video content, right, like that's a lot more useful to kind of post on social as well. But yeah, we try to find an overlap and look for things that are going to stir up conversation. But if there aren't any, right, or if you're if you're working on, say, maybe you're building out your content around your API documentation and things like that, like it's not necessarily something you're going to go talk on social. And so from there, you've got to talk to the subject matter experts in the company, figure out what their strong opinions are, help them create that content, right? You want to produce that on your website as well. And then that makes for really good topics on social.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think that when it comes to creating the content for social media, that kind of goes back to one of the big mistakes that you said people have with their topic clustering is going off of gut. And I think what's clever about what you guys are doing is unless you said something you just horribly, I'm going to say horribly boring, because nobody is looking up API documentation unless this is very specific context on Instagram, right? No one's searching for API data on Instagram.
Right.
However, for everything else that's not that, you essentially have well-vetted information to be able to make your content from, that you're like, no, like for sure people have this problem. And so when I get to talk about this problem in the video or the photo or the graphic that I make on Instagram or whatever it is, the platform that your customers are actually on, like to say probably LinkedIn, then like this is actually going to resonate with them and connect with them, because this is research-based content. This is not just a gut instinct creation right here, which I think is definitely a better use of time and energy and marketing budget to be able to piggyback off of that research.
Yeah, and it's, even when you're not the subject, let's say whoever's handling your social isn't necessarily a subject matter expert themselves. What's helpful about this approach is that when you interview a subject matter expert as you're creating the content, because you don't want people you don't want a novice to write content for people who want to buy, like especially when it's say middle or bottom of funnel or thought leadership type content. Like I don't even like doing it with top of funnel content, frankly. Like I want to write a level that's going to convince the people that would buy that I'm a peer, right? And that I'm not an intern. So that's not they don't always have time to write that content, but whoever the writer is, they should be interviewing them, right? And being able to pull those insights in. And so the insights that they've, heard and received from that subject matter expert that they've incorporated into that piece of content on the website, those can be then posted on, on social, whether it's from their account, if they're doing it for that person on their behalf, or from the brand account. You're not going to get as much reach, but you can still actually, create things that are going to resonate with people. Useful too is look at the feedback you get from social, like not just the engagement, but like what are the comments going on, right? Like, can you get people to comment? Can you have conversations with people? Use the feedback from those conversations to also kind of let right? Like, are people actually interested in talking about this, and not the vanity metrics, right? Like,
right,
a handful. Imagine what the value is, right? Of having 5 back and forth conversations with who your target ICP is, right? Like in a threaded comment on one of your posts. Like that's super valuable. So
right. That's that post publication research, right?
Yeah.
So before we get into customer conversations, one thing that just popped in my brain is maybe a valid question is typically we're talking about like visuals aside, right? And we're talking about like the written content that you guys have vetted and created, and based on the topic clustering and stuff like that. How do you feel about those things getting published on like stuff like Medium or LinkedIn articles or stuff like that? Like, have you seen those things perform well in those situations because of like the Google related data searching and optimizing that you've been doing? Or like, is that something you recommend people do, or is that kind of just like a no-brainer, just like try it and see what happens kind of thing?
I think that it probably has a place if you don't have if you're a brand new site, or if you're an individual who's trying to build a little bit of a personal brand within a company. I don't think there's anything like inherently wrong with it. I think it's often a distraction though, depending on what your goals are. I think too many people try to do too many different things, right? Rather than giving a strategy time to really kind of play itself out, know if it works, and really like refining that. It's time and time again, right? Like, this is what we tell a lot of the clients that we work with on projects that we're, providing strategic advice on, is that they always want to produce new content, right? Because that's more fun. It's more exciting when you can often get more value from optimizing what you already have, right? And so that's the same sort of concept with posting on LinkedIn. Rather than looking at different channels to try, find one that works, and then like really make it work more, right? Like, keep optimizing it, right? The 1% difference in conversion rate from one platform, right? That has major lift whenever you're looking at larger numbers. So that's what I would do. Again, like, maybe if you're a smaller site, that would be fine. But I'm not a fan of syndication really at all. I don't see the value of it. Like, like, focus on building your brand, and like make it like building your brand through your content, and people will just come to you. You don't need syndication.
Right. Okay. All right. So now I want us, because you brought it up a couple times now about right, there's like analytical type data that you guys are harvesting and researching and stuff like that too, but obviously that's not the only kind of data. So tell us a little bit about customer conversations and things like that. Like, talk to us about what you see in value in that.
Yeah, so I think that a really great part of the value, really just from a marketer's perspective, is that instead of guessing about who your audience is, right? Like, you actually really get to know them. Instead of being abstracted from it. Salespeople get to talk to the customers all the time, right? Customer success gets to talk to customers all the time. Marketing often doesn't. And that's bizarre to me, because it's marketing's job to go attract these people, right?
Right.
So the primary value is that you actually get to finally understand who your customers are, what their pain points are, right? That informs positioning, that informs messaging, that informs the direction of content strategy, right? That informs the direction of how do you want to speak to these problems in your content to drive the right type of leads and make it come off as more authentic, right? A drive strategy across social, etc. That's where I think the most value kind of comes from. Outside of that, like, you kind of, I guess, like, get to realize that maybe a lot of the stuff you've been doing in the past that was probably wasting time, effort, and energy, it may have been producing leads, right? But it wasn't really producing the right type of leads. You can start to reduce those sorts of activities, right? And focus more on what's going to work. And sometimes that's often harder, right? It takes more time.
Yeah.
But that's where the value of quality over quantity kind of comes into. But I'm happy to dive into other kind of specifics there, like that qualitative data too. You'll learn a lot about attribution, especially, right? Of how wrong your attribution is.
Well, maybe it'd be helpful then if you were like, I don't know if you guys personally have a story or if you have a client story of someone who had kind of like a eureka moment, if you will, in having some of those customer conversations. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah. So there's a company we're working with that focuses on producing. They actually like ghostwrite books for people, like help them publish. And we were kind of going after these kind of broad ideas related to, how do you choose a book title? How long should a book be, et cetera, right?
Right.
And it worked. It drove leads to them, right? But also drove a lot of unqualified leads because they were specifically targeting people that had, their ICP were CEOs that wanted to tell a story, right? More like a memoir, or CEOs who wanted to write a book to help kind of build their own brand, right?
So or like thought leadership kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Or high performing athletes, right? Who have gone on to something else, et cetera. And so that type of content we were creating, it was working great. So we started talking to these people and we realized that the ICP, like the real problem to be solved, the real thing that we needed to go after was addressing the fact that they wanted to leave a legacy behind, right? That they wanted to put their thought leadership out there, that they wanted to grow their brand if they hadn't quite made one for themselves yet, right? It was the acceleration of their career. And so all this other stuff related to what should, how to create a book title, how long should my book be, that was much later in the funnel, right? Versus addressing what the real root cause was about, why they might want to do this. It also helped inform strategy when it comes to, you can think of it as like problem unaware, right? Like people who they want to build their social capital, right? But they haven't ever thought about the fact that writing a book could be a mechanism of doing that, right? And so then that helped us when we create that content. That gives us more thought leadership content to post on social and to run some paid social behind, right? To kind of raise awareness of how this could help you.
Meaning that they were trying to target people who weren't even searching about book writing.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay.
So that helped a lot there.
Dang. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So they just ended up starting creating content just based around that like topic of legacy, and then that just kind of ended up obviously that would be much better targeting when it came to who they're talking to.
Yeah, you can go into broader topics, things like like how to build your personal brand, right? And then you can talk about all the different ways to build your personal brand, and one of them can be writing a book and publishing a book, right? Going the self-published route. You don't have to go through additional publisher, because then you can take a more middle funnel to kind of explain like the pros and cons of self-publishing versus going through traditional publishing, right? And then that's how you kind of work them and convince them that they should do this option with this company, versus going through a traditional publisher.
No, I like that a lot. That's really that's fun. I can imagine that writing an article about like how long a book should be is lots of search traffic, but man, that is broad.
Yeah, very, very broad, because they weren't going after fiction book authors either, right? They weren't going after people who were writing fiction, who were writing novels, children's books, et cetera, right? It's business books, it's mindset books, productivity books, performance books, those sorts of things.
Right. That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, hopefully that worked out for them. I imagine it did.
They're doing great. So
well, and even better, what a great business model. They're actually targeting people who can afford to hire their services.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that really goes back to your whole point about, and that's been so funny in our journey too, is like back to your example about writing the article about Google My Business. And it's like, you attracted a whole bunch of people that can't afford to hire you, which is nice that you're helping them. But at the end of the day, then you kind of have to put it in the like philanthropy box almost, instead of revenue driving. And it's funny because like the term small business has a wide variety of meanings to it.
Yes,
and from maybe even too big for us to hire as a business or be hired on as a client for, to so small that they can't afford to like eat too nice of a restaurant for dinner. You know what I mean? Like it's crazy, the range.
Altruism is great, right? But I think that's something that you naturally progress into once you're in a position to be able to do it, right? So you got to focus on how do you actually grow, either go public or if you're bootstrapped, maintain profitability until you hit a certain threshold, right? You can think about altruism later. Like again, we'd already done it, learned our lesson, right? It was a great lesson learned. I'm glad we learned it kind of on ourselves versus our clients, right? But but that's something, everything, it just builds up experience over time, right? You kind of learn what works, what doesn't, and grow from that. So
absolutely. No, that's cool. Well, cool, man. Well, hey, I want to respect your time. And so we're rolling up here on 10 o'clock my time. So thank you very much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it. I certainly got a lot of great value and tips and stuff like that I'll be writing on my little blackboard over here and going over with my team. So hopefully it's been helpful to many others as well. I'm sure it has. So if you could just let us know, we'll be putting in the description and comments and stuff like that, like the actual links to get a hold of you. But if you could just let people know where they can typically run into you and where you're most responsive at, that would be amazing.
Yeah, the best place to reach me, frankly, is going to be on LinkedIn. You can search for Skyler Reeves, Skyler with an E, not an A. You'll find me on there. Feel free to hit me up, chat. I'm always looking to have conversations with people and learn. But yeah, that's the best place to reach me and consume content and or just have a chat and ask me questions, or just try not to pitch me stuff if you don't mind. You gotta warm it up. So.
Wait, that happens on LinkedIn? No way.
Oh yeah, it's wild, huh?
Yep. The other day
we don't do any outbound. Like we're vehemently against it, right? So we don't we don't pitch anybody. So.
Well, at least I think if it would be just a little bit more respectful if I felt like they actually did research on my company before messaging me like, hey, it looks like you do stuff in marketing. You would be perfect for our business. And I'm like, what kind of stuff are you talking about? Like, what kind of stuff do I do? I'd love for you to tell me what I do, because you clearly don't know.
There was just kind of throw something in there too that people might find helpful. So again, we don't do outbound, but what we do when we do have conversations with people, if we just try to provide value, we don't try to pitch them, but we will try to like learn a lot about that person first. And we use a tool called Obsidian, and it's really useful. It's it's like a note-taking tool, like works in Markdown, but we kind of built a little system in it where what's really cool about it is you can link ideas and thoughts and people and stuff together in it. It's just a straight like notebook editor, but it's got these wiki style backlinks. They're like bi-directional links, whatever. But what's nice about it is that I can be writing about a concept that I'm learning about or something where I read somewhere, right? I can do this and just backlinking it. What's nice is it finds where you've talked about something that you haven't linked together, right? So it can say, hey, you were talking about XYZ and this other person was talking about the other day where you took notes on something they wrote on LinkedIn or whatever. And so you start to draw these concepts and these connections between people, between the things that you've got going on, but also what's interesting is between the things that other people have going on that are related to things that other people have going on, right? And so you can become this connector of people where you're saying, hey, imagine getting a DM from someone saying, hey, I saw you were talking about this. I read this other thing about this other person the other day. You might find interesting too. You guys should connect and chat, right? Imagine being that person, right? The connector. There's a lot of value in being a connector of people. But then beyond that too, is you start to find these interesting connections and ways to relate to people that you would have never even thought of. So an example of this was, I won't say names, but there's a popular influencer in our industry, right? And naturally you want to build relationships with other people who have your audience. And by looking through my graph, right? Because you can see this really cool graph view of how everything connects. I could see that, okay, this person is into running, right? I knew that they had a husky, right? And I was like, huh. So it's interesting because then I used to be a CMO of a running company, right? I have a husky. Small things like that, right? And the only reason we knew they had a husky is because we watched a YouTube video, saw a husky run around in the background, and we just note these things down, right? And who knows where the connection is going to be. So whenever I was chatting with them, right, like I think it was on Twitter later on, right, they shared a picture of their husky. I shared a picture of my husky, right? Started a conversation, and now I'm connected with this person. So
you have to physically do the note writing, but then it can help identify trends in like a topic or something within other things you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to do that. You got to put in the work, right? Like it's a relationship building. I think too many people have tried to automate it, right? And you can't automate relationship building. So you got to put in the work, but it really pays off in the long run because you can really, think of it like the whole, what was it? The 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like that. You start to find really interesting ways that things that either people that you know or things that you're working on, how they relate to people. We all talk about personalization when you're trying to reach out and build relationships, right? Like it's a really fantastic way to do it without having to, the way that we approach it is we just kind of take notes casually. I'll block out an hour a day when I'm going through. I'll just kind of take notes down, not only what I'm working on, but things I'm reading about, right? And so when the time comes, they just sort of surface, they emerge.
Yeah.
Without you having to manually go find it. And so instead of prospecting to find outbound opportunities, these opportunities just sort of emerge for you, and you can say, "Oh, well, here's this connection." It's serendipitous, is the way I kind of look at it. It works great. So
no, that's really helpful. I mean, I love learning, so I'm always reading books and articles and all this other stuff. And it's like, I don't know if like if it's just me, if I just don't have a high enough IQ or whatever, but like there's so much data coming into our brains at any given time, you can't possibly quantify all of it and provide meaningful connections on that. So that sounds like that Obsidian is helpful for that, to be able to make sense of it. It's like big data for your brain.
Yeah, it's effectively built to be a personal knowledge management system, right? And it's free. So hey,
how about that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, cool. I appreciate that. I'm going to go check that out. That sounds awesome.
Cool.
Well, Skyler, thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Wanna cause no problems. I just wanna live my life, but I keep on hearing about nonsense. Me and my dons ain't mobsters, but you know when you see imposters. We know how to read them faces, same way you know how to read them comments. If you wanna talk, let's talk, but around here, make sure you're walking your talk is constant.